They say the photograph's still a chest, hidden in a cedar chest, beneath folded quilts that smell of dust and kerosene. The image is cracked down the center, like the paper itself tried to forget what it held. A man and a woman stand shoulder to shoulder in front of a sagging cabin. Their eyes two hollow moons staring into a lens that never should have opened. The man's hand rests on the woman's shoulder, not tender, not proud, just claiming. Their faces are nearly identical. Same jawline, same thin lips, same gray film over their eyes. Behind them, in the corner of the frame, there's a cradle. Empty. Those who've seen the photo say there's something wrong with the light, as if the sun itself refused to touch them. The air around their faces bends, faintly blurred, like the world was repelling them in quiet disgust. It was taken in 1887, deep in the Appalachian backwoods, where the rivers run black with iron and the soil remembers every sin ever buried in it. No names written on the back, no photographer's mark, just two signatures, side by side, in trembling ink, Amos and Sarah. The story that followed would be whispered for more than a century. A union the church refused to bless. A wedding that sealed not love, but lineage. The valley where they were born had only one family name left by then, and their blood had turned against itself long before they said, "I do." They were not husband and wife. They were brother and sister, and their marriage was not an accident. It was the final echo of something ancient and deliberate. Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? The valley lies tucked between ridges that never appear on maps. A place the wind seems to forget, where fog lingers for weeks, and the trees grow gnarled and twisted as though recoiling from what has lived beneath them. In 1798, a family of Scots, Irish settlers arrived, claiming this narrow swath of land as theirs alone. They were Presbyterians, proud and silent, preferring the company of their own shadows to strangers. By the mid-1800s, the valley had become a world apart, a collection of cabins spaced like tombstones, all under the same name, all bound by blood that circled inward, never outward. Letters and fragments of journals speak of the settlers' desire for isolation as devotion. They spoke of the outside world with disdain, describing towns and roads in tones that read more like curses than directions. It was a paradise to them, but also a cage, and in this cage, children were born who seemed off. Midwives who ventured in from neighboring counties returned pale, faced, clutching their stomachs at night, as though the valley's air had left its mark on them. They whispered that the babies were too still, too quiet, too sharp in ways no one should be sharp, as though something old had chosen them before the world had a chance. Amos Coburn entered this world in 1861, on a winter night that smelled of frozen pine and iron. The midwife, a stranger brought in because no Culban woman could spare herself, later told her daughter that the boy's cry was hollow, more a sigh than a sound. His head was elongated, oddly shaped, like the skull of some animal preserved in a museum drawer. His eyes, pale as river stones, refused to blink. She claimed, later, that she had the urge to leave him there in the snow, but something deeper, a dread older than her own fear, stayed her hand. She left instead, locking the cabin behind her and telling no one. Amos's siblings were the same. The cousins were worse. Deformities multiplied like a shadow stretching in dim light. One girl was born without a roof to her mouth. Another boy had 6 fingers on each hand and could not hear. Another child crawled until death took him at 12, never learning the dignity of upright walking. The valley tolerated this as normal because they had no standard outside it. no mirror to reflect what the world would call wrong. In this twisted ecosystem, the abnormal became ordinary, and ordinary ceased to exist. The family's lineage was a closed loop. Amos's father was also his uncle. His mother was his father's sister. Grandparents on both sides were siblings. Every attempt at a family tree dissolved into circles, branches folding back into themselves, until it resembled a tangle of roots rather than a tree. By the time Amos came of age, he was as close to a clone as a man could be. By the time Amos drew his first unsteady breaths, something in the valley seemed to shift, as if the hills themselves were aware of the child's arrival. He walked with a lurch, bowed at the knees, limbs too long for the body that carried them. His jaw protruded in a grotesque arc, leaving his teeth incapable of meeting properly. His hands trembled without pause, and seizures claimed him often, folding his small body into spasms that left the air thick with the scent of sweat and iron. It was said that the shadows in the cabin lengthened when he slept, crawling along the walls as though drawn to the unnaturalness he carried. Sarah, 2 years his junior, arrived with her own mark of the valley's curse. A cleft palate forced her words into whispers and groans. Her spine curved sharply, a visible echo of the looping bloodline she shared with Amos. She would spend hours crouched over in pain, rocking slightly, hands pressed to her abdomen or along her back, and the elders would murmur blessings over her suffering. Chosen, they said. The Lord tests those who are pure. No outsiders stayed long in the valley. The occasional traveling photographer captured images that would later vanish into basements. Never printed, the negatives fading into obscurity when a minister visited once. He noted in his journal that the children seemed touched by something old and wrong. His handwriting trembled on the page. Their eyes do not see as ours do. Their hands tremble with a memory they were never given. He never returned. Inside their cabins, the children learned silence and obedience. Play was rare, laughter rarer. Sometimes they would sit by the hearth for hours, tracing invisible patterns into the dirt floor, speaking to no one but the ghosts of their ancestors. At night, the valley exhaled screams that no one recorded but all felt. The wind carrying the twisted moans of a line, collapsing inward on itself. The valley itself mourning. Letters preserved by a distant cousin suggest the elders understood the danger of marrying within the bloodline. Yet their convictions were stronger than fear. God made us this way, Jeremiah Coburn wrote in 1878. The outside world cannot know. Those who leave are lost. Those who remain are chosen. In this, they were both prophets and executioners, preserving a lineage that would bear witness to its own decay. By the 1880s, there was only one name left in the valley, one family, one story repeating until it became indistinguishable from legend. And into this story stepped Amos Coburn, a boy who was more shadow than flesh, a vessel of a genetic echo that had been folding back on itself for generations. The day Amos married Sarah, the valley held its breath. There was no pastor, no songs, no laughter to mark the union. Jeremiah Coburn, patriarch of the valley and keeper of its twisted traditions, conducted the ceremony himself. His Bible was worn so thin that light passed through the pages like smoke, casting faint shadows over the couple's faces. Sarah's body was bent, her spine forcing her into a posture that seemed like perpetual submission. Amos swayed beside her, mouth half open, eyes glazed, as if already seeing through the veil of this world into something darker. The wedding meal was quiet. Cornbread and salted pork, eaten without comment. The air smelled of damp wood and candle smoke, mixed with the faint iron tang that always seemed to linger around the cobburns. Outside, the trees pressed against the cabin as if listening. No birds sang, no wind dared move. Even the dogs slept in unnatural stillness. The valley itself had recognized the moment, marking it in silence rather than ceremony. 9 months later, Sarah gave birth to a boy. He lived for 4 days. The midwife, a Cobburn woman hardened by years of repetition, whispered in the corners of the cabin that the infant's heart lay askew. His lungs failed before they could take their first full breath. They buried him beneath black walnut trees, unmarked, unnamed. It was the 7th infant lost that year, and the valley swallowed each one in quiet indifference, a ritual of grief without ceremony. Sarah became pregnant again, and again. Each child carried the same cruel inheritance. Twisted limbs, malformed organs, eyes that could not see, mouths that could not speak. By 1891, she had borne 5 children, none surviving beyond 2 weeks. Her body, already weakened by malnutrition and congenital strain, began to collapse entirely. Infections festered where cuts should have healed. Hair fell in clumps. Teeth loosened in her skull. Age had no dominion over her. Youth had long departed. Amos too deteriorated. Seizures increased in frequency, becoming near daily events. Sometimes he would wander the woods for hours, speaking to unseen figures, laughing and crying at once, returning mud-streaked and incoherent. The family called it the confusion. Modern medicine would have called it dementia, early onset and catastrophic, likely driven by the genetic collapse coursing through his veins. He could no longer recognize Sarah, nor any familiar face. He existed as a shell, a witness to the decay of his own line, incapable of intervening as the cycle repeated. The valley outside remained indifferent. Trees bent over the cabins, wind carried whispers through empty fields, and the river ran dark and slow. It was as though the land itself was mourning, or perhaps rejoicing in the finality of the Coburn's self-imposed isolation. Theirs was a world without outsiders, without mirrors, without context, and within it, every act of survival, every gasp of breath, was a defiance of nature itself, a whispered testament to the cost of faith and lineage, of obedience and secrecy. In 1893, the valley finally met the outside world. A railroad survey crew, mapping a route through the Cumberland Gap, stumbled upon the Cobburn settlement. They were unprepared for what they found. Children with sunken eyes, adults moving like broken puppets, the air thick with a quiet despair that clung to their clothes. Thomas Hargrove, the foreman, recorded in his report that the cabins reeked of decay and dust. The floors scarred, but the scent of illness persistent, like the valley itself exhaled sickness. He noted the silence first. No voices above a whisper, no laughter, no arguments, not even the barking of dogs. Every sound seemed swallowed by the hills. Even the wind hesitated, brushing over the valley in hushed steps. Hargrove suggested aid doctors, relocation, education for the children, but the Cobburns refused. Blind Jeremiah, the patriarch, replied with a chilling certainty, "We are not dying. We are being refined." The crew left, unsettled. The route was changed. The official reason: unstable terrain. In private correspondence, the men admitted their fear. One wrote, "Some places God has forgotten. That valley is one of them." The Coburn's isolation was no longer merely self-imposed. It had become an impenetrable shroud of dread, a living nightmare preserved by choice. Amos and Sarah continued their existence in silence. By 1895, Sarah was pregnant for the 8th time. This pregnancy, unlike the others, endured longer than expected. Hope flickered for a moment, fragile as candlelight in the wind. Tiny clothes were stitched, corners of cabins cleared, a cradle constructed. Yet, when the child came, the eyes were absent, smooth skin where they should have been. It lived 6 hours, writhing and moaning, before death claimed it. The cradle remained, empty and cold, a monument to repetition and failure. Something fractured in Sarah that day, not her body, that had been broken for decades, but her mind. She stopped speaking, stopped eating, rocking endlessly with hands clutching the empty cradle. Amos, lost in his own fog, barely noticed, murmuring to the air outside, as if conversing with ghosts only he could see. The valley continued in its quiet judgment, indifferent to grief, indifferent to survival, indifferent even to the persistence of death. By the spring of 1897, Sarah Cobban was gone. Official records listed wasting sickness as the cause. But the truth was simpler and darker. She starved while surrounded by sustenance, abandoning the world entirely. She was buried among the 8 children she had carried and lost, unmarked, unnamed, as though their existence could be erased by mere silence. Amos did not attend. He was found in the barn unconscious, having bitten his tongue halfway through during a seizure. For the next 4 years, he lingered, a ghost in life, hand-fed, uncomprehending, trapped within a mind that no longer connected to the world around it. The Coburns had created their own monsters, and now those monsters inhabited their own flesh. Amos' decline was a mirror of the valley itself. By 1900, the population had dwindled to 73 souls, half of them children, and half of those children would never survive to adulthood. The air smelled of rotten iron, the soil soaked with unmarked graves, and the cabins sagged under the weight of years and neglect. Still, the Coburns refused to leave, refused to marry outside, clinging to the belief that their suffering was sacred, their bloodline holy. Pride had become indistinguishable from delusion. The valley was a laboratory of decay, every generation folding into the next, the same mistakes repeated, the same bodies broken, the same cries swallowed by the hills. Even death could not grant relief. The children who survived infancy carried, in their DNA, the collapse of centuries, a biological echo of obedience and isolation. Their existence was a warning written in genes, a testament to faith twisted into ritual, a warning no one could hear outside the valley's fog. Amos' body, too, betrayed him. By the time he reached 40, his spine had curled into a permanent fetal position, limbs rigid and unyielding. When he died in 1901, the family could not lay him flat in a coffin. He was buried beside Sarah, atop generations of Coburns who had suffered the same slow decay, each mound of earth a silent chronicle of pride, faith, and destruction. No markers, no names, just soil, black walnut roots, and the whispers of ancestors who had watched the line twist inward like a serpent devouring its own tail. The state of Kentucky eventually intervened. In 1911, after reports of extreme malnutrition, deformities, and deaths reached the governor's office, teams of doctors and social workers were sent into the valley. What they found was horrifying. Photographs show hollow-eyed children, twisted adults, and cabins collapsing into decay. The report was sealed for decades, its details too grotesque, too unsettling to be released. The surviving Coburns were removed, the children placed in institutions, the valley abandoned. Forests reclaimed the fields. Cabins collapsed, and the family cemetery disappeared beneath poison ivy and underbrush. The descendants who survived rarely speak of their origins. Many never knew them, names were changed, records hidden, histories buried alongside the corpses, yet the genetic echo did not vanish. In 2003, a doctoral student studying hereditary diseases discovered traces of the Cobban genome in Appalachia. DNA tests confirmed what the valley had whispered for generations. Amos Coburn was functionally inbred to a degree comparable to multi-generational self-fertilization. He should not have survived to adulthood. The fact that he did was a grim testament to endurance, not life. Amos had existed in a prison of flesh, a cage built from faith, blood, and isolation. His life was measured not in days, but in the quiet collapse of a lineage that should have ended centuries before. And though the valley is empty now, the thought persists: some monsters are not born. They are created, slowly, deliberately, in the name of purity. The valley's silence became its own monument. Empty cabins leaned like exhausted sentinels over fields long returned to forest. Black walnut trees, once markers of graves, now tangled with poison ivy, roots twisting over buried secrets. The creek ran dark and slow, carrying sediment and memory downstream, and even the wind seemed hesitant to stir. For decades, the world forgot the Coburns, and in forgetting, it allowed the story to fester in shadows. Yet traces remained. In the 1980s, a genealogist stumbled upon letters and photographs buried in an attic in Louisville. They were faint, brittle with age. Each image a ghost of the Valley children, with elongated heads and glassy eyes. Adults whose limbs bent in impossible arcs, and faces identical across generations, as if the bloodline had been mirrored in every newborn. The genealogist traced the lines carefully, noting that each marriage, each birth, had compounded the genetic collapse. The Valley's secrets, once whispered only to the wind, now emerged as undeniable proof of deliberate self-destruction. Interviews with distant descendants painted a fragmented picture. Some remembered vague tales of cabins burned to the ground, of elders refusing doctors, of infants who never breathed outside the womb. Others spoke of names changed, of adoption into families who refused to acknowledge the origins, of a legacy so shunned it could not even be spoken aloud. It was as though the Valley's sins had leapt across time, hiding in DNA, in silence, in memory, waiting to be unearthed. Modern medicine confirms what the Valley folklore always suggested: extreme homozygosity, repeated inbreeding over generations, produces catastrophic effects on the body and mind. But in 1887, the Coburns understood nothing of genetics. They knew only the law of their blood purity above all. Even as they watched child after child die, even as deformity became the common face of their lineage, they pressed onward, believing themselves chosen. Faith, twisted and unyielding, was a cage as binding as any genetic legacy. Amos, in his last years, became a living ghost. He could not recognize faces, could not walk or feed himself reliably, trapped in convulsions and confusion. Yet the Valley treated him with the same silent reverence it had given all of its broken. He was neither husband nor father in the way the world understands those roles. He was a testament, a relic of a doctrine written in flesh, a warning that obedience without reflection destroys both the body and the soul. The photographs, the DNA, the letters, all bear witness. The Valley, once alive with whispers of choice and divine purpose, now rests empty, haunted by the repetition of its own mistakes. And what is left is not merely a story of deformity or death, but a meditation on belief itself, how adherence to faith and tradition, unchecked and absolute, can shape life into horror, and horror into history. The Valley, long abandoned, kept its secrets beneath layers of forest and frost. Cabins collapsed into splintered ruins, doors hanging from rusted hinges, windows gaping like hollow eyes. The cemetery, if it could still be called that, was a field of subtle mounds, unmarked, indistinguishable from the earth around them. The black walnut trees that once marked the graves now stood like grim sentinels, their roots entwined with the bones beneath. Hiding names and stories in the dark soil, descendants of the Cobbans, who survived the relocation, rarely spoke of the past. Some never knew it themselves, others had been told only fragments, half-truths stitched together to conceal the depth of decay. Names were changed, records sealed, letters destroyed. Yet the echoes remained, etched in their DNA, in subtle deformities, in whispered fears, in the inexplicable pull toward isolation. Even in new towns, under new roofs, the shadow of the valley persisted. Researchers in the early 2000s began piecing together the fragments left behind. DNA analysis confirmed what the old letters and photographs suggested. Amos Cobban's genome exhibited an unprecedented level of homozygosity, a repetition of identical sequences inherited from both parents far beyond what had ever been documented. He was, in scientific terms, an anomaly, a human being whose very existence was a defiance of biology. Survival, in his case, was endurance. Life was a slow and relentless unraveling. Yet the story of the valley is more than biology. It is a record of obsession and pride. The Cobbans believed themselves chosen, set apart, above the natural order. Every act of suffering, every deformity, every death was reframed as holiness, proof of divine favor rather than warning. They passed down doctrine like inheritance, binding body to belief, each generation repeating the sins of the last with unwavering devotion. Choice, here, became indistinguishable from inevitability. Amos Cobban died in 1901, 40 years old. His body, bent and broken, was buried beside Sarah, atop generations of families who had been consumed by the same cycle. Their graves, unmarked and unremembered, became part of the soil itself, a testament to a lineage that destroyed itself from within. The valley remained empty, haunted not by spirits, but by the consequences of blind faith and obsession with purity. Even now, the lessons of that hidden valley endure in whispers, in remote communities, in isolated families, in the quiet repetition of patterns passed down as tradition. The horrors of the Cobban line were not only physical, they were spiritual, cultural, and psychological. They remind us that the most terrifying monsters are not those imagined in tales, but those we create ourselves, in the name of devotion, tradition, and blood. And so the valley remains empty, save for the wind that coils through the hollows, carrying echoes of lives that should never have existed. Cabins have rotted into the earth, fences have fallen, and the forest has swallowed the fields whole. Yet, if you listen closely, the soil seems to remember. Each mound, each root, each hollowed grave murmurs of choices made in faith, of pride valued above survival, of generations folded inward until the line could no longer bear the weight of itself. Amos Cobban married his sister because he was taught it was divine will. He watched 8 children die, one after another, because obedience was sacred. He spent his final years in a haze, unable to recognize himself, speaking to ghosts that perhaps were the only family left to him. And Sarah, broken in body and mind, surrendered to silence and starvation, while the valley held its breath around her. Their lives were not tragedies in the way a storybook tells tragedy. They were slow experiments in human endurance and self-destruction, carried out in the name of holiness. The outside world eventually intervened. Children were removed, families displaced, the valley abandoned, yet the lesson remained buried, waiting in DNA, in history, in the few remaining records that survived time and secrecy. The photographs, the letters, the journal fragments. They testify that the Cobbans were warned, yet they persisted, believing their suffering a mark of virtue. And in that persistence lies the true horror. They were not ignorant. They were deliberate. They chose collapse. There is no closure in this story. The valley cannot be restored. The graves cannot be marked. The lives cannot be reclaimed. What remains is a whisper, a warning that echoes through time. Belief can be more deadly than any disease, faith more destructive than any famine. Isolation can become its own plague. Pride can crush bloodlines, bodies, and minds alike. And those who insist on purity at all costs may one day find themselves alone in a hollowed world, wondering why the air refuses to move and why the trees lean inward, listening. What would you do if you discovered your mother was also your sister? If the blood you trusted was the same that cursed you? If faith demanded horror and obedience ensured decay? The Cobburns believed they were chosen. In the end, they were. Not in the way they imagined, but chosen nonetheless, as evidence of what humanity can endure, and what it can destroy when tradition eclipses reason, and belief outweighs life itself.